Hi, I'm going to give you some few analysis as regard to the WTC collapse, the World Trade Center, the September 11, 2001. I studied physics and some engineering courses. I did physics analysis for about 3 years. I have been quite practical physics analysis experience. When I first saw the collapses, I was absolutely convinced that they were not spontaneous. One of the first things I did was to speak to one of my colleagues who are Army engineers, retired, fellow who has done a lot of demolition and construction. Showed him some of the public source videos are available, and he immediately pointed out that there were squibs, little puffs, smoke, essentially coming out of the building, which were clearly sign of controlled demolition. He had no opinion behind that, but he said that without doubt it was a controlled demolition. That sort of suddenly continuing to examine it and trying to gather as much evidence as I could. The question I pose, what don't we know and why don't we know it, is sort of addressing the fact at this point we still do not have meaningful explanations through what happened to the buildings. We have had several studies which I will go into as to trying to determine of a plausible scenario for a collapse. As of this point, none of them have presented us with anything that I think could be reasonably called convincing and detailed narrative why the collapses was occurred. The question has been addressed previously, the enormous destruction physical evidence. As Chris was saying, the site was scrapped very thoroughly. Out of the entire mass of the buildings were destroyed. The National Institute of Standard and Technology, NIST, who now doing the ongoing investigation, managed to save about 240 pieces out of the entire buildings. All of the rest of it was basically recycled. The obvious question, what does it mean? There was controlled demolition at the simplest level. It means someone had a lot of access to the buildings over a long enough period of time to set this up. It implies, as many other things tonight, that the people who have the effective control of the site, how things scrapped, and making sure no information was available. Forensically, constructions couldn't be done. Even in my smallest catastrophe, will typically reconstruct things as completely as possible. For example, like TW8500, reconstruct pieces were going shaft at the bottom of the sea. Completely constructions was done to allow detailed analysis. In this case, the exact opposite was done. The first report was really issued on this by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Authorities, in collaboration with the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE, that had very limited access to the site. A lot of the pieces they were able to retrieve will retrieve by going to landfill and trying to gather or find the interesting pieces before they were disposed of. The initial FEMA report basically acknowledged the kerosene wouldn't burn out very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed very rapidly. What would only really serve for the ignition for the rest of the materials. The view here really strictly office contents. If you think of the modern office with copying machines, computers, as has it has been mentioned previously, the smoke, particularly from building 2, just before it collapsed, was very black working. This is generally an indication of insufficient fire, which there is not enough oxygen for the amount of fire. These types of fire were very cool. They are not hard flames like low torches. The cores themselves, if you see in the diagram of the building, there are large central rectangles in each of the buildings, contains 47 columns, and these columns were the primary structural support of the building. They were given the role of supporting the whole gravitational load of the building. Since they were so strong, it would have been reasonable to think they would have stood at least to some extent to collapse. But as we see the building collapse, there was basically little steps, these things standing a floor or 2 above the ground level. The cores did not have much in them with Ben. The cores were dedicated to things like elevator shaft, utility shaft, stairways, you have drywall materials, you have little bit of carpeting. You don't really have inflammable materials in the core itself. The core was specifically designed so it could not function as a chimney. It did not want, in a case of fire, the fire to be able to travel through the elevators or through air to come in. They were designed with this architecture and Swiss-key. They were referred to hermetically sealed system. They were fire shutters, which I'm going to show you. The fire shutters, which the yellow columns, basically this is the supporting system for the fire shutting. This is the system would have prevented the smoke from traveling upside down, but unfortunately the system was failed. As far as we know functions, probably there was very limited amount of oxygen. Okay, as far as issue of what failed and how, some of the initial suggestion, and these show it up in the NOVA documentary, which is a good example of what I would like to co-approve by the computer animation. Thomas, this is the NOVA documentary. Thomas Eager, who is material scientist, but he's not a structural engineer, who became a spokesman for this documentaries, indicated somehow the flow failed. The trusses supporting the flow fails, and this was the theory that put forward in the initial FEMA report. Subsequently, there have been complete contradictions of that. Jim Hoffman have done quite a bit of the research available on the web concerning with this idea, the flow with symbol fallen. There was a study done by Weidlinger Associates, the chief engineer Nafis Labi, who is very well in motority and building collapses. He is specifically this about the idea of bankaking or the collapsing of the floors. The most recent, the most recent official we have now one is which from the National Institute of Standard and Technology rejected the idea floor collapse was part of it. So basically, as a result, we basically have no sequential model at this point. What NIST has suggested, there was some kind of simultaneous collapse, but they have not attempted to give any kind of modeling in the way they claimed. Unfortunately, the materials would allow the detailed fire analysis, the actual physical evidence all gone. As not attempted to give any kind of modeling as to whether, to what cause could have been in fact being destroyed by the fire in the way they claimed. Unfortunately, the materials would allow the detailed fire analysis, the actual physical evidence all gone. So as a result, basically, we have no sequential model at this point. What of the most significant thing to my thinking indicates of this could not have been sort of collapse. We told it was the presence of the dust clouds, and as you have seen in the pictures, I'm sure all of us have seen more than we would like. They were very, very large clouds, very thick dust that enveloped the area, crossed the rivers, made it almost all the way to New Jersey from the pictures I have seen. This type of flow, something that we are familiar with in physics, it occurs only in two situations we know of naturally. One is in volcanical action, where a large amount of materials suddenly exploded into the air, basically forms small particles. The other situation, something called turbidity currents, and this is occurred along the edges of cut metal shelves where made that or settlement or slumped and became suspended in a water. The common thread, you have a large amount of dense materials that is suspended very quickly, thereby creating another denser fluid, which is in fact the dust clouds, and that the fluid can achieve considerable velocities. The problem with creating the sort of slow refined particles is that there is really no mechanism has been proposed. We have concrete floors with carpeting, we have flooring over them. Basically, they are coming together in the collapse, but the concrete is basically protected under these layers. Early in the collapse, in the very first moments, we see thick clouds being directed in very high speed. They clearly dance because they flow downhill and became part of this overall pyroclastic flow. We've been told that the concrete of sort of jumped up in the midair, exploded itself, and then was ejected as the floors came together. It's not a plausible mechanism. I have yet to hear of anything else proposed to explain it. From quite few people on the scene, we have been told powder represented most of the concrete. The amount of the intact macroscopic chunks and the concrete on the scene were negligible. Everything was reduced to powder. Incidentally, beside the concrete, there are other things reduced to powder. And incidentally, we also know other things beside the concrete were reduced to powder. Contents of the computers, exotic metals from computer chips, these sort of things were also identified in the dust and in very small particles, generally in an order of less than 100 digram in diameter. So we have real issue of mechanism. What in the process of this could cause so many things to be vaporized. So finally, for the towers to collapse, where we saw them to collapse, basically implies the columns into themselves. The telescope straight down still keeps a lot of its structural integrity even when hit. Until we begin approaching the melting point, you don't really see a catastrophic loss of strength, and this is what we are talking about. We are talking about the vertical box columns collapsing into themselves, which implies complete loss of mechanical strength. And this recent NIST studies made an interesting point about the World Trade Center 2 The film analysis, it shows that it isolated for about 4 minutes after was struck by the airplane. The isolation was identical to what would be expected to the intact tower. World Trade Centers most modern buildings are heavily redundant in the sense that the load bearing can be shifted. Other members of some of them fails, and we saw that happen. In this case, trusses do redistribute it, but absent for the weakening of the structural members, the distribution is limited. The structure is restabilizes unless there is unless this progress to further weakening. It doesn't progress to a total collapse. World Trade Center 1 began collapsing from very top after an hour and 40 minutes. It's very hard to imagine office contents progressively heating up harder and harder over that period of time, and the building to collapse from very top, which is at least heavily loaded. It's also very odd to say. Just a couple of other anomalies: that there was report of explosion, there were reports of underground explosions in the both buildings or the towers at the time of the impact, from the building engineer by name Philip Morali. On the web from Node Plaza Storm 9/11, we see the lobby of the North Tower was extensively damaged, and this is immediately after plane collision. We know that on the weekend before there were power downs and the period of the evacuation drills going on through the previous week, which suggests that at least some people know that something was happening. The power downs may represent time window which demolition charges would have been presented, although it is possible it also would have been presented much longer period of time. It's giving the relevant accessibilities to the buildings. Okay, that's all I have to say.